how important is it for you to focus on the building of the world that you're setting your story in? Hi, I'm Marcus, and I'm the idiot on the writer's block. When telling a story, any story, no matter where it's set, you need to give your readers a sense of the world that story inhabits. Even if it's set in the real world, the reader still needs to know what that real world feels like. This is even more pressing when your story is fantasy or sci-fi, because the reader needs to understand what the general rules of that universe are. Examples of worlds being built in fantasy include the Wizarding World in Harry Potter series, or a world in which cybernetically enhanced humans are in a circus for human pleasure in the Cyborg Tinkerer. So here's the question that we put on the writer's block. How important is world building? And what tips must we remember when building our worlds? Here are our experts to give us some tips on how to succeed at world building.
World building is the part of the story where you actually create that world around the characters in the mind of the reader. And so when you're walking down, let's say, the street in a small town versus the street in New York City, very, very different experiences. You can describe the way people walk, the way people act. In small towns like where I'm from, the pace is a lot slower. In the cities, it tends to be a lot faster. And so when you're building that world, especially in like a fantasy or things along those lines, that encompasses everything about those worlds. So you might be thinking about not just the architecture or the pace of the world, but also what the general income is, how the different marketplaces work, the economy, what is money, is it standard, this paper money, or is it coins? Is it trading, as in I'll give you 2 goats for a donkey? What is the actual trade value of these things? Are we in a low income area, high income area? What's crime? What is the magic system? Is magic unlimited? Is it limited in some way? In the Eragon series, it's limited by this internal source. In Harry Potter, for the most part, it was limited by the use of a wand. In Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, it's limited by person. They have different kinds of magic that different people can use, and not all people can use magic. And so when you're building your world, you have to take all of these things into consideration. When you are actually creating that world on the page, things that you want to keep in mind are what is the person who's viewing it seeing. If you were to walk into the living room after you turned my dog loose on the living room, you would probably notice there's a tear in the couch, there's fuzz everywhere from some pillow that is no longer, you would notice these things. When you walk into someone else's home, you can get a lot of information about that person from what you see. And so you have to be kind of like an investigator in that sense. So when someone walks in, if they're very into electronics, let's say, and this person has this massive TV with, all the little acronyms that go with it and all the numbers and the whatever stuff, surround sound, all that fun stuff. Someone who's really into that would notice, but as a reader, we're like, hey, they must have money because they're using it on this stuff. And so when you're world building, you want to take these things into consideration. The thing that pulls the reader into the story is that ownership, where they can come up with the conclusions. So if you walk into a house, or if the character walks into a house and they say, oh, this is a wealthy family, that takes that ownership away from the reader. If they walk in and they say that it was a marble floor with a grand staircase, looks kind of like the inside of the Titanic, has, whatever surround sound, all that fun stuff, then the reader's like, oh, these guys have money. They don't just have like normal money. They've got like super amounts of money. So the world building it goes obviously from global, but all the way down to the specific, depending on who's looking.
So world building in a nutshell for me is making a world that feels lived in. That is the best way I've learned to describe it. And 3 really good tips that I've picked up over the years on world building. The first is to describe everything in the 5 senses. So I know that sounds like a very basic tip, but when you think about the reader, they're experiencing this world for the first time. And if it's a fantasy world where it doesn't exist, there's no, the cities and the characters and maybe even the races of characters are different, you want the readers to be able to experience that. And the best way to do it is through the 5 senses. So putting the reader in the character's head and then describing the world through the character's head in the 5 senses is a really, really good tip. So I'll give you a perfect example of this. In my last Dragon Lord series, the main character is a bloodthirsty Dragon Lord. And how would a dragon see the world? Like, they're not going to see the world the same way we would. So to me, like thinking about like animal biology, a dragon is going to be able to smell things way better than a human could. So when I'm describing things through the eyes of the dragon, he's going to pick up on smells first. So just like little things like that. The second tip I would give is to do a little bit of understanding in the beginning of the history of the world. So even though the reader doesn't necessarily know it, you want to understand what that is so that you can be consistent as you're describing things in the story. And the third thing I would say a good tip is consistency. So one of the things that I learned to do, there's kind of 2 ways to do it. You can kind of do your research in the very beginning, and you can outline what the story is going to be and what the different details are going to be in each chapter, or you can outline as you go. And I find that outlining as I go makes a lot more sense. So like, for example, if in chapter 3, a character walks into a flying car, and the flying car takes them over the city and they have to do what they have to do, you kind of want to remember the mechanics of that flying car, and you're going to want to remember how the car works so that when they get back into the flying car in chapter 8, you can be consistent. Because that's the one thing that'll take readers out of a story is if you're inconsistent in how you describe the world, they have wait a minute, what's that moment? So consistency for me I've always been very, very careful to be consistent in the stories that I write, because nothing will pull a reader out of a story faster than that.
Quite often I've found when people are writing worlds, they're too logical. Everything's ordered because somebody's planned it. And I've found that real world isn't logical at all. And in this story, in this graphic novel, there's wars. The North of people come down sweeping out of the mountains and slaughter everything in sight. And not for any reason, not for any logical reason, just because they feel like it. And I think some elements of chaos or things like that in a world are very important.
There has to be a sense of immersion in the world. I know that I think I read the first book in the Witchland series, The Truth Witch, which it was like, oh, there are these countries and these countries and these countries at war. And when they named these the people from these different countries, I had no idea what they looked like, and I had no idea why I should care about them, because I wasn't introduced to what they looked like, what their culture was, what their interests were. This is more from like a historical fiction perspective, but there are things that I think are important to research, people's uses of verbiage, costume, the surroundings, the politics of the time. I find those sorts of things as a historical fiction reader, historical fantasy reader, those are important to me because those break immersion immediately. I was reading a book the other day that was supposed to be set in the 1900s, but then this guy is like, oh, well, I don't want to think about my ex right now, and which is like sort of just not a thing that would be said at that time, and that sort of thing really breaks me out of the story. So that's more of a historical fiction perspective, but those are important to me.
Sometimes if world building is at the forefront of what I need to do, then I do the research. So for example, with Butterfly Fish, for the Benin section, I definitely did, I was definitely super conscious of world building in that section of the novel because I really wanted to do it justice, you know. So that was why I read the books. I took a trip to Nigeria. I visited like old parts of Benin. I spoke to different people. So I was very clear that world building was really important and at the forefront of creating the sort of tone and I guess space that will really make the reader feel invested in that part of the novel. And then for other pieces I build the world as it comes along. The first part of I guess the early part of Butterfly Fish, which is set in modern London, I'll tell you something that's funny. I found it harder to do the world building in that than I did the bit focused on Benin. And I think it's really interesting looking at that as a writer. I think the reason for that is in writing the section about Benin, there's some distance there, because I'm not writing about modern Benin, I'm writing about a past Benin. So that distance gives you a certain freedom, gives you a certain room to play. Whereas focusing on like modern London, I don't know, I just found it slightly trickier, even though in the end it was fine. But then, you kind of have to, I guess, do justice to certain spaces because, people will be looking and going, well, that's not really what it's like there. Or that place doesn't exist in that particular part of London. Or what does she mean by that? You know what I mean? So it was, for some reason, it was slightly trickier. So it's just interesting. Sometimes what you think is going to be easier to do ends up being the opposite. I thought I would find the Benin part hard because of all the research that needed to be done and because of the distance, but actually it was a joyous experience writing that part of the novel. Like, absolutely wonderful to write that part of the novel. This is my favorite part of writing Butterfly Fish. And then the part that I thought would be easy, which is the modern day part set in London, that was the bit that I found really hard. So isn't that a funny thing? Like, the fact that it sort of turned on its head in that way. So yeah, you just never know, really. You kind of have to go with your instinct as a writer. You have to listen to your instinct as a writer. Sometimes you're writing the story and you say to yourself, oh, okay, I'm not going to stress about the world building because I know that that's going to come as I'm doing it. And then, you go with that. And then sometimes you might be really panicked about contextualizing a certain world, and you do lots of research for it because you want to make sure that you have a really strong grip on that world. So you just have to listen to yourself and do what feels right.
Two things. So one, reading in your genre and literally highlighting and color coding the pattern, so to speak, of professional authors. So there's a pattern to writing world building to make sure that you're not doing it too much. We don't want, Moby Dick where we spend 10 pages talking about a painting on a wall, or, Tolkien where we're spending 20 pages talking about a tree, right? So what is good and stylistic of your contemporary authors today? So literally, like put a yellow highlighter on dialogue, and then put a blue highlighter on action, and then a green highlighter on world building and descriptions, and then like a pink highlighter on emotions and things like that. Going through and finding the patterns that published authors utilize. See that in your own writing too. And if you have to honestly print it out yours and see if you have an entire 2 paragraphs worth of that blue description world building, then you probably should look at the pattern that published authors have had and say, okay, I can take these 3 sentences here and move it to here, and this and move it to here, and now our patterns match. So it's a little bit more scientific than I think most people actually do, but it usually works when you realize, and it forces you to realize exactly how much and what type of world building you should have. But the second one was always allowing your readers' brains to work for you rather than against you. So we all have really individualized concepts and perceptions of what worlds look like in our brains, right? So, you know, there's so many characters that we have perceived differently and seen differently within our brains because they're only described as having, you know, blonde hair and being slender, or, you know, like red hair. And like hair is one of the most popular descriptions of people, and that's all they give. There's no other description, and every single reader will start to build that description of this character on their own. So allowing your readers' brains to work for you, because they're going to visualize their world the way they need to in order to make sure it's fluent, and your characters the way they need to in order to make sure they can honestly, like, what do I want to say, connect with them. So, and their actions and their dialogue all sound different to each individual writer. So you can't force what you're saying and what you're doing and the world you're building and that you see onto your readers, because they're never going to connect with it. So honestly, vivid descriptions that are minimal. So you want beautiful wording and fluent style, with minimal description and only what your characters honestly see as a person. So I'm going to, you know, like I hate books and manuscripts that start with the sun bleeding through, you know, the windows, because I think it's stupid and I see it every day, and I don't care about the sun, I care about your character, right? So what does your character notice on the street? Do they notice the guy with the blue shirt? Do they notice, you know, that person's sneakers that were amazing and you really want to buy them? Or are they noticing, you know, the shop maker who looks, you know, sketchy over there? So it depends on what your character notices, and you want to make sure that it's true to who your character actually is. And then minimal world descriptions and world building, just to help your readers connect the dots, is what usually makes it most successful. So making sure, you know, you find the pattern and you're not overdoing it or underdoing it, and making sure that you're true to your characters and really not like allowing your, or I should say, true to your characters and really allowing your readers' brains to work for you rather than against you.
And there you have it. Tips from experts on how to successfully world build. You can check the description below for links to their work. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with their tips on how to build a world? Do you think the world building isn't as important as we think it is? Or maybe you have your own ideas on what to focus on when you're constructing the universe of your story. Whatever the case may be, please leave your comments down below. And don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and subscribe to get more expert tips on how to write, publish, and promote your first fiction novel. I'm Marcus, and I'll see you next time.